You may be seated. Good morning, Oakcommunity.church. Let's try that again. Yeah. Good morning. All right. Ready for a good day. Hey, I like Kalila said, I just want to welcome you here, especially if this is your first time. We believe church is a family, and that means we're vulnerable with each other. That means we celebrate the highs and lows and everything in between. And so thank you for checking out our crazy family. And we mean what Kalila said, that if after 5 weeks you don't feel like this is the right church for you, that's okay. We'd love to help you find one that is, a church that'll point you to Jesus. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for trying 5. Now, we are jumping back into our series going through the Gospel of Mark, which is something that we started earlier this year. We took a break in July because we started going through Summer of Psalms like we do every year, and we went through 4 different Psalms in the book of Psalms, and now we're jumping back in to the Gospel of Mark. But before we get in, let me ask you something. How long did it take you to realize, or when in your life did you realize that life isn't static? That life doesn't stay the same, that it's unpredictable. I think we all learn that at some point, that life doesn't stay the same, that sometimes there are things that come our way that we don't always plan for, or maybe we do plan for, but they don't happen in the way that we think they will, or they don't happen at the same time that we plan for them. Right? You have good weeks, you have bad weeks, maybe you have boring weeks, and we learn that that's just a part of life. Life isn't static. And neither is our faith. When we think about our relationship with God, there is a confidence and a stability in knowing that God will never leave us or forsake us, or that he'll use what the enemy meant for evil, as Kofi sang, and we sang a moment ago, that he'll use that for good. But at the same time, there's this reality where there are sort of highs and lows in our faith. Just take a look at this illustration real quick. So there are times in our life where you might feel that you are on the peak when it comes to your relationship with God. Things are going well. God has showed up in a big way in your life. You're experiencing a surge of physical growth. But then there are other times where we find ourselves in the valley. There are things that maybe we've been praying for that we haven't seen God come through, or maybe you're struggling in your finances or in your relationships, and maybe you're even wondering if God cares. But then I would say most of the time we are probably somewhere in between. We're maybe not at the mountaintops. We haven't just had a God moment, but at the same time, we're not in the valley. We're somewhere in between. And I think the interesting thing about valleys and about mountaintops is you can't have one without the other. You can't have a valley without a mountaintop, and you can't have a mountaintop without a valley. And so there's this reality to our walk with Christ where we find ourselves in some seasons walking closer to him, maybe more in step, more in tune, and then other seasons where we find ourselves in the ditches. Again, wondering if God even cares. And so how do we navigate that in our faith and in our walk with the Lord? And the beautiful thing is God knows that we are human, and that's how we experience him. And so God has so much compassion and grace with us in that. And so as we talk about our faith, I really want us to focus in on that, of how do we maintain our faith? How do we walk in faithfulness during the ever-changing seasons of our life? Whether, again, you've had that mountaintop experience or whether you're going through something incredibly tragic, how do we walk in faithfulness during those seasons? And that's what I want us to focus on. And specifically, we're going to look at 2 different ways that faith presents itself. 2 things we can learn from our story this morning about how our faith can lead us and shepherd us through those times. But before we jump into that, I think it's important that we ask ourselves the question, what is faith? Because we talk about that and we hear faith, that word being used in the news or in books or television, and people mean faith in a lot of different ways. Some people, when they hear the word faith, they think of, they basically think of blind trust, ignorance. Right? So you're ignorant about an issue, but you're trusting that it'll happen, so you have faith. But what I think the Bible gets at when it talks about faith, and we see this in the way that the word is used, is faith is sort of like a parachute. So think about it like this. If you're about to jump out of a plane, you have a parachute. Now, faith involves an intellectual knowledge about something. So there's a knowledge we have about the way a parachute works, that we believe, well, it's going to capture a certain amount of air and it's going to bring us down at a gentle enough speed that we won't splat on the ground. There's a knowledge there. But faith isn't just knowledge as we know. It's not just a list of beliefs. But there's another component to that. There's a trust we place in our beliefs. And so in a similar way, there is a different relationship you have with a parachute versus when you're studying in the classroom as compared to when you're about to jump out of the plane. Like when you are about to put that backpack on and say, I am going to trust this parachute with my life. Those are the two sides of the coin that Scripture presents us when it talks about faith. Is its belief, its knowledge of who Jesus is and what he came to do. But then the other side of that is it's actually putting your trust in that person. It's actually putting your trust in him. It's saying, without him, I am going to splatter on the ground. So with that in mind, let's take a look at our story. We're going to be in Mark chapter 9 today. And the words are going to be up here on the screen if you want to read along with us. Just a little bit of a quick summary of where we've been. So we're a little over halfway through Jesus' ministry. And what we looked at before we took our break was Jesus and a few of his disciples literally had a mountaintop experience. They came to what is often referred to as the Mount of Transfiguration, where the disciples witnessed a piece of Jesus' glory, his divinity breaking through. And his disciples were in awe of what had happened. And they engaged in a little discussion. But now they're coming down from this mountaintop, and they come to a rather unpleasant sight, right? Sometimes that's just like life. You have this mountaintop moment with Jesus, and then you come down into the grit of life. And that's where we pick up our story here this morning. Verse 14, this is what Mark writes. It says, when they came to the other disciples, speaking about Jesus and the three disciples who were with them, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. Well, as soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and they ran to greet him. What are you arguing about with them? He asked. Well, a man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground and he foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. All right, so just take a quick pause here. So here we see sort of a familiar story. Somebody brings somebody to Jesus in need of healing. And here it looks like there's a couple of things going on. Not only is there an evil spirit that's racking the boy, that's taking control of the boy, but it also looks like there's a physical component as well. Many scholars say that these signs are the signs of what we would say is a seizure happening. And so this boy is being hit with a double whammy, and his dad doesn't know what to do. So what he does is what many people do, is they hear about this wonder-working, miracle-working Jesus. And he takes his boy to him, hoping beyond hope that Jesus may be able to help. The problem is, when he shows up, he doesn't find Jesus. He finds some of his disciples. It's sort of like showing up at the hospital ready to deliver your baby, and the receptionist said, I'm sorry, but the doctor is not in today, but we have an intern. He'll take care of you, right? Like, it doesn't inspire much confidence. And the same thing happens here, where the boy takes them to the the man takes his boy to the disciples, but they can't do anything about it. Now, this is extra strange because a couple of chapters ago, we read earlier where the disciples were sent out by Jesus. And when they came back, they reported the incredible things that had been done through them. They had healed people. They had cast out demons. And so they were incredibly successful last time they went out. But now when they come to this situation, when Jesus leaves them for a few days, somehow they're ineffective. Right? We have to ask the question, what changed? Well, let's continue with the story for a moment before we answer that question. So Jesus responds in verse 19. He says, you unbelieving generation. Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring me the boy. Now, probably this little rebuke was directed more at the disciples than it was at the father. But nevertheless, Jesus was frustrated at their lack of faith. And he continues in verse 20. It says, so they brought him, the boy, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell down to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. And when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And the spirit shrieked and convulsed him violently and came out. And the boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? And Jesus replied, this kind can only come out by prayer, or can come out only by prayer. So again, we have another one of Jesus' miracles, but there's something deeper going on. There's something I believe that Mark is trying to draw our attention to that he wasn't in previous miracles. Many of the previous miracles we've looked at of Jesus, they often were to show how Jesus has dominion over nature and spirits and sickness and disease and uncleanliness. And so Mark's already demonstrated that to us. And so why is he showing us this other miracle? There's a purpose. And I think it's because Mark is trying to highlight something that Jesus has addressed before. And that is unbelief and the nature of unbelief. You see, there's no question that Jesus could do this. Everybody who's reading along with Mark knows, of course, we've seen Jesus do things even harder than this. But there's something, there's a cancer, a spiritual cancer that reveals itself in the disciples, and that is unbelief. And that's where I think the heart of our story is found in verses 17 and 18. Sort of the crux, the plot. Let me just read it one more time. This is when the Father addresses Jesus and he says, Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. See, I think one of the possibilities of the reason why the disciples weren't able to cast out this spirit, and I think this is hinted at, and especially hinted at later, and we'll take a look at this, but is that the disciples had become so accustomed to their newfound authority that they had forgotten the one who gave them that authority in the first place. That they had become so confident in their ability, like we've done this before. Yeah, bring us the boy. We don't need Jesus, okay? He's gone. We'll handle it. That there was an overconfidence such that it left them to realize that there's really nothing they can do apart from Jesus, apart from dependence on him. And so they failed. See, a pattern that I've observed in Scripture, as well as just in life, is the effect that experience can have on a person. We sometimes think that with age comes wisdom, and that is true. Age does bring wisdom, but we also see, again, when you look at the kings of the Old Testament, and when you just look at people in life, you see that sometimes age doesn't bring wisdom. Age brings arrogance. And I think part of that is because when you've been around the block, when you've been at your job for a while, when you've raised your kids, suddenly we start to think, I know what I'm doing. I'm all that in a bag of chips. We start to think, well, maybe I don't actually need to depend on the Lord in prayer. Maybe I don't need to rely on his sustenance in my life. We start to think, maybe I can do this on my own. And I think that's what happened to the disciples. And I think that's often when moral failure happens, especially in leaders. Because suddenly they've been around the block enough that they say, I don't need to have the same guardrails that I used to have up. And again, I think that's part of the disciples' failure, and Jesus knew it. And what we also see is that when we fail to depend on God, it doesn't just hurt us. It doesn't just harm us, but it also harms those around us. Notice the man's response in verse 22. But if you can do anything, talking to Jesus, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us, if you can. You're not sure if I can? If you can. Everything is possible for one who believes. You see, what had happened is that the disciples' failure to cast out the evil spirit because of their overconfidence had an effect on this man's faith. Because he's thinking, well, if the students can't do it, maybe this issue is of such a magnitude that not even Jesus himself can do it. It's a reminder that our lives have influence, that our faith and the way that we follow Jesus impacts others around us, that the way that we respond to crises can have an effect, both for the positive and for the negative. That the way we respond in dependence to the Lord can influence the faith of somebody else. And so then what is this man's response to Jesus' challenge? Verse 24 says, immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. And this one verse is for me, probably one of my favorite verses in the entire Gospel of Mark, and I think it's one of the most genuine expressions of faith. Because this man is saying, I think, what so often we feel, which is, God, there's belief. I believe, I trust you, but I'm still doubting. God, I believe that you're going to come through, but I'm also struggling to believe. It shows how the human nature is this walking contradiction, that our faith is rarely as pure as we want it to be. And when Jesus talks about a childlike faith and what a beautiful thing that is, the older I get, I start to see why, because with young kids of my own, they're so trusting. They're so trusting of the things I say sometimes when they come out of their mouth, I'm not even sure if I believe it. Yeah, that's safe, I think. I think that's safe. You know? But they're so trusting. There's just no doubt in their mind. But the older we get and the longer we live, suddenly we start to have those insecurities crop back up. And that's normal, by the way. That's normal. Just like it's normal for us to start questioning things in life. Does my boss actually know what they're talking about? It's normal for us to do that in our faith. And that's what this man is doing, is he's saying, God, I'm this walking contradiction. I believe on the one hand, but I'm not sure my faith is quite there, but I still have my doubts. And here's the beautiful thing, is Jesus doesn't rebuke the man. He just got done rebuking the disciples. You faithless generation. Jesus is not afraid to mince words. He's not afraid to call it like he sees it. But yet here, he doesn't rebuke the man. He responds to his faith. Again, this man's honest, vulnerable, imperfect faith is put on display, and Jesus honors the little bit of trust he has by healing his son. And so here's what we see about the nature of faith. I said that there were two things about faith that we were going to see. Here's the first thing. So if you're taking notes, this would be the thing for you to write down. It's this, is that faith doesn't need to be perfect, but it does need to be genuine. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be pure. It doesn't mean you don't have questions, but it needs to be authentic. It needs to be real. It can't be a faith on loan from your parents or from your friends or a faith on loan from your culture. It has to be yours and it has to be genuine. No one in the Bible has perfect faith, right? And for those who do have a mature faith, which is what we want to see, that is a part of the Christian life, that we are growing in our walk with the Lord. That never happens overnight. It'd be much easier if it did, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time. And again, so what's important is that our faith is authentic, which I think has at least two applications. On the one hand, it means that you and I, we don't have to condemn ourselves for wrestling with God over our doubts. One of the things I'll say with people oftentimes when they come to me and they have questions, whether that's philosophical or whether that's personal or moral, is I'll say, listen, I'll say one of the best things about this conversation right now is not the fact that you have doubts and all that, but it's the fact that you care enough to ask those questions and to wrestle with it. To me, that is one of the healthiest signs of spirituality, that somebody's willing to wrestle with their faith, because apathy, in my opinion, is a much more serious spiritual disease than doubt. It's when somebody says, I know I have these problems, but I don't care about it. It's not that big of a deal. how do diseases often fester? It's when they're left untreated. We took my daughter to the urgent care the other day because we thought she might have a UTI. And if you don't treat UTIs quickly, they become a big deal. Turns out she didn't. Probably just didn't drink enough water. But we acted because we knew that if left untreated, it was going to turn into a big deal. And the same is true with our faith. So if you are wrestling with God right now, keep wrestling. Don't condemn yourself. You don't have to have a perfect faith. You have a genuine faith. And again, it doesn't happen overnight. We don't treat anything else in our world like that, as if it has to be perfect the moment we step into it. Think about soccer or any sport. But if one of the criteria for playing soccer was that you had to play, at a professional soccer level, nobody would start because nobody starts knowing how to play. I coached 5-year-olds in soccer in the spring. They have no idea what they're doing. They're like a herd of bees. They just run after the ball. And my biggest job was keeping them from picking flowers while they were playing on the field. That's all it is. And so if that was true in soccer, nobody would play if you had to come in already knowing what you're doing. The same is true in our walk with Jesus. If we had to have a pure, perfect faith, nobody would ever start following him, and nobody would be good enough to follow him. Now, on the other hand, the other thing this teaches us is that a genuine faith, though, on the other hand, is not a careless faith. As I said, apathy is a much more dangerous spiritual disease than doubt. So faith is intentional. It is a desperate grip on hope. I was reminded of a story earlier this year. Some of you might recall. In January, there was a flight, an airplane that was leaving from Oregon and heading to California. And once the plane had reached 10,000 feet, a door panel blew off. You guys remember that? All over the news, Alaska Airlines. And the thing was if you've been on a plane, you know that those emergency doors, well, they're near a row of passengers. And so there was a 40-year-old man who was the closest to that. And when that door blew off, he freaked out because he thought he was going to be sucked out. And he had a reasonable fear to think that because the very shoes that were tied onto his feet were sucked out the door, as was his cell phone. And he, in reporting to reporters later, he said that when that happened, he just gripped onto the chair, for dear life. He said, I was hanging on for dear life. And he said, I was staring at that hole because I was thinking any minute, either it's going to grow bigger or I'm going to be sucked toward it. I'm going to be sucked out of my seat. And fortunately, about 30 minutes later, which I'm sure felt like an eternity, the plane landed. And he was fine. He was safe. Everything was good. But he had this death grip on the seat. And in a similar way, that's how we need to be holding on to Jesus. Is he didn't say, wow, I'm about to be sucked out. Let me just casually put an elbow over it. No, he gripped onto it with everything that he had. And he didn't have the perfect technique. There may have been a better way to grab a hold. There may have been something else he could have done. But what he knew to do was, I'm going to grab onto that seat because this is a matter of life and death. And so in a similar way, for us, having a genuine faith doesn't mean it's careless. It means that we are desperately clinging on to Jesus with everything that we have. It's clinging to Jesus in the same way that man clung to his chair, right? It's not a perfect grip, but you give it everything you got. And so that means if you have a little bit of faith, you give every ounce of it to Jesus. That means if you have a lot of faith, you give it all to him. Everything you've got. This is why we can say with Jesus what Jesus told to his disciples in Matthew 17. He says, for truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, and that famous quote by Jesus, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. All right, it's not so much about your faith as it is in the one in whom you put your faith. So whether you have a lot or a little, you give it to him and you watch him show off. And again, if you ever have any doubt, look at this poor man who said, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus responded by doing a miracle in his life. Now this leads to the second thing we learn about faith. Continuing, Mark again says in verses 28 and 29, he says, Mark writes, after Jesus had gone indoors, so he had left the scene. So the crowds were amazed, all that, they left. Jesus went back with his disciples, and as often happened, the disciples said, what in the world is going on? And he said, why couldn't we do that? And Jesus said, This kind can only come out only by prayer. Now, what in the world does that mean? Some translations, by the way, you might have a Bible that says prayer and fasting. Just a little side note, that was probably added later. Later traditions added and fasting. And so the earliest manuscripts we have just say this can only come out by prayer. But how does that relate to unbelief? And how does that relate to what we've been talking about? Well, think about this. What is prayer but dependence on God? What is prayer if not coming before the throne of God saying, I can't do this. I need you to show up. That's why I said that if Jesus is saying, listen, the only way this Spirit would have come out is by prayer, that leads me to think, well, it sounds like the disciples weren't praying. Or if they were praying, they weren't praying with dependent hearts. They weren't praying saying, God, we need you to show up because I can't do this. And that's the second thing we learn about prayer is that faith is dependence. It is dependence on God. It is the parachute you put on and you say, I believe in all of the engineering that went into this backpack, but I am trusting with my life that this is going to take me to the ground safely. It's dependence, right? It's not an abstract set of beliefs, but a real daily dependence on the Lord. That applies to every area of your life, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter what age you are. About 3 decades ago, something amazing happened. There's this small town in the middle of nowhere called Possum Trot, Texas. Maybe some of you have heard this story before. Possum Trot, Texas. And in Possum Trot, Texas, which I believe is a town of about 700 people, there was this couple, W.C. and Donna Martin, and they were a couple that lived there. W.C. was the pastor of a local church, and it started with Donna, but then it eventually moved to the whole family. They had this deep burden for the foster children in the foster care system in this area. And they had this deep, deep burden that these children are going unloved, or they're being passed around from family to family to family to family. And so it started with him and his wife where they said, we're going to do something about this. And so they started just with themselves. They started adopting children. Over the course of a few years, they adopted 4 different children, but they knew they couldn't solve the problem on their own. And so they started to get the church involved. They started talking about adoption, both in a spiritual sense that we were adopted into God's family through Jesus, and how by loving God, they can love their neighbors, specifically these children who don't have a safe, loving home to go through. And so God started to do a work in that little community, and in a few years, I think it was 23 families adopted 77 children. 23 families adopted 77 children. That's like 3 children a piece. And in an interview, he was saying it wasn't just, big families or retirees, but he said it was everyone. He said it was single folks. It was people with kids. It was people without kids. It was everybody got in on this. And he said it wasn't easy because many of these kids had been tossed around the foster system and they had scars from it. He tells a story about one of his adopted daughters, how there was this instance where he said he was walking in her bedroom, and he said he just felt that something wasn't right. He just felt like it wasn't right. And so he started looking around, and he found under her bed a backpack that had been stuffed with food. And he said he realized it was because this girl and her little brother, who they also adopted, had been in 9 foster homes in 1 year. And she was worried that if this family kicked them out, they might not have food. She was scared. And so he realized that if they were going to have, they and their community, if they were going to make any difference in the lives of these kids, they were going to need to depend on the grace of God. And so in an interview earlier this year, he said this. I just want to read it to you. He said, this is looking back, right? Looking back 3 decades. He said, if people had done the math, it doesn't add up. How on earth could a little church out in the bushes make a move like that? He said, well, I'll tell you, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God said we can do it, we did it. I'm not going to tell anyone it was an easy road, but if you just stay with it and you stay with God, he's going to make it right and he's going to bring you through it. And he said it was that just simple dependence on the Lord that allowed that community to do something where now looking back, these kids have gone to college. They have had lives that they never would have dreamed of because God put a burden on these families to say, you need to love some people who may be very hard to love. Love some people who might be very different than you. You need to put yourself out there. And that's not to say that everybody had those experiences or that's always the case what they experience, but the reality is that adopting 77 children in a small town is no small feat. But they made it through because they depended on the Lord. So it doesn't matter whether you are depending on him to get you through your next work cycle, your next busy work season, to get you through a difficult season in your marriage, or even through the terrible twos. The point is that you can depend on God, that he is dependable. He is dependable. And if you feel like you're not sure, like I just, Grayson, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know if I'm there. I'm not sure if I can sort of mentally, emotionally get there. Well, how do we learn dependence? One of the ways we learn that other people in our life are dependable is we do life alongside of them and we let them reveal to us the way that they are dependable. And so my encouragement with you is just to stay with them. As Pastor W.C. Martin said, is stay with God and let him show you that even when you and I are not faithful, he is faithful. Get into his word and read the stories of his faithfulness. Listen to people who have been around the block in their faith and let them tell you of his faithfulness. So again, we've seen that faith does not need to be perfect, but it does need to be genuine, and that faith is dependence on God. And so wherever you are in your faith, I hope that this morning you found some encouragement just to take the next step on the pilgrimage of faith. And if you're sitting here and you're not sure where you stand with God, and you're not sure what your faith looks like, or even if you have a relationship at all, I encourage you to start by asking those questions. Christianity is not a religion that leaves its followers with all the answered questions they have. But it does invite us, and God invites us to dialogue with him, to engage with him, to think, to ask the questions. And that's what I would encourage you to do. If you're not sure about this whole Jesus thing, if you're watching online, you're not sure about this Jesus thing, start asking the tough questions because he's not afraid of them. I like what St. Augustine said, old Christian from a long time ago. But he said, all truth is God's truth. So don't be afraid to ask the hard questions, but just keep seeking him, submitting yourself to him, and watch him show up in your life.